mammal, the Eurasian Harvest mouse, is a charming, adorable little rodent that some people keep as pets. Other people have breeding and re-release programs due to their dwindling numbers. They are really not that common in the pet trade, and you'll probably be hard pressed to find some constantly available unless someone has excess from their breeding population, and it's going to be even more rare to find them in rescues, if at all. Mine I did get from a rescue, however the most common way you're going to come across them is by people selling them. Now there's not really any reputable harvest mouse breeders out there in the same way there is for fancy mice and fancy rats. It's not really an established community as such, so they are mostly on things like selling sites, and you do have to be really careful. Just make sure the animals look healthy and also check that they are putting in new genes and new mice occasionally into the mix. Most sellers won't and can't guarantee the sex of the harvest mice if you are buying babies. Just because they are so small, it is very tricky to sex them compared to bigger rodents, so most sellers aren't going to give you that guarantee that you're not going to have a mix of males and females, so that is something to be prepared for. If you're watching this and thinking of owning harvest mice, please never ever take them from the wild, although you'd have a pretty hard job finding them to do this in the first place because the numbers are diminishing so much. So also, if you don't live in Europe and you're wanting to own them in America, for example, I'm not really sure the legalities or if you can even find them as pets over there, so I can't help you with that one too much. In the wild, harvest mice will make their nests very high up on vegetation such as corn stalks, and they're very lightweight. They only weigh around 5 grams on average, and in the wild they don't live much past around 6 months old. In captivity they can live anywhere for about 2 years to 3 years on average. So I just thought I'd make a general care video going through the basics, because there's not really many videos out there or any care guides out there going through everything. So hopefully this is helpful if you are considering getting them and giving them the right care. And if you have owned things like fancy mice and fancy rats, I would personally say, having owned all of those, harvest mice are a lot less work, they're a lot less maintenance, they smell less, and generally I'd say they are easier than keeping fancy rats and fancy mice. So when it comes to their enclosure and their home, they have to be kept in a glass tank type setup. They are way too small than any cage that has any bar spacing. Your best bet is to go with something like an Exoterra or a similar brand that has very fine small mesh, just because they are so small and you don't want anything that has really big openings. If you are considering making your own DIY enclosure for them, a bit like the one I've got behind me for my fancy mice, just make sure there's not any big gaps because they will escape. And if you are going to use your own mesh, I wouldn't go any bigger than about 0.5 centimeters, just because they are so small. Size wise, for a group of same-sex harvest mice, I wouldn't recommend going any smaller than about 60 by 45 by 60 centimeters. Some people keep them in 45 by 45s, but they will utilize all of the space. They are very active, and the taller the better really, because you are going to struggle to fit in things like sprays and millet and all of those activities and items. They're really going to enjoy climbing, so if you can go super tall, I do recommend doing so. You also want to make sure that enclosure is packed full of toys and items and places to hide. They are a prey species and they have to feel secure. I've got some silly comments in the past saying that I'm suffocating my mice by putting in too many things. That's kind of the point. You want them to feel secure in their space and have places to hide if they need to. You want to put in things like branches, ladders, cork clogs, hides, hanging baskets, nests. All of that has to go in to help them feel secure and also enriched. Once they do feel secure in their space, you will see them darting around between things, and they are so fun to watch. They also have a prehensile tail, and this means they can use this to grip onto things and hold things, a bit like a monkey does when they're climbing around, and this is so fun to watch. You can provide them with a wheel in their enclosure if you want to. Mine have got an 8-inch wheel from Boog Estate, and they do use this, they can push this. I was quite worried at first they wouldn't be able to spin this, but they do and they enjoy it, so you can put a wheel in if you want to. I do recommend this because they are so active and they will use it. In terms of a water source, you can use both a water bottle and also a water bowl. I wouldn't recommend just using a bottle with them because they are so small they might sometimes struggle to get the water out, and if these do get blocked or stop working, they can dehydrate and go downhill very, very quickly. So mostly I would choose to use a bowl and give them water in this. Just make sure this isn't a very, very deep bowl because obviously they are so small they can possibly drown in this. So if that's your only option, place in some rocks or pebbles just to give them a way to escape this. And if you are using a very, very shallow bowl or dish, just make sure to check this very often because if that water source again goes down, they can go downhill very, very quickly. You do need to be careful in winter they're not getting too cold and going into torpor. Just make sure if your house does get pretty cold and goes below roughly 15 degrees Celsius, you're attaching a heat mat to the side of the glass. And of course make sure this is attached to a thermostat just to be safe. So when it comes to the substrate in the base of the enclosure, you can use pretty much most, if not all, conventional beddings sold for rats and fancy mice, things like hemp and kiln dried shavings. Give them a good couple of inches of this at the base of the enclosure. They're not really big on digging or burrowing compared to other rodents, but just give them a good couple of inches and also some hay on top, and they will enjoy kind of hiding themselves in the hay. You don't really have to worry too much about how absorbent that bedding is because harvest mice produce so little waste. There's really not much of a smell when it comes to things like ammonia. They don't produce much waste at all, so you don't really have to worry about your bedding choice being the most absorbent. And of course when it comes to cleaning them, they don't need cleaning that often because again they don't make that much waste. I'd say maybe a deep clean if you are using conventional beddings every 2-3 months maybe, and of course spot cleaning them in between because they do make their water bowls very, very disgusting. Their wheels also, they are going to pee and poop on these, so spot cleaning, things like that. But when it comes to a big deep clean, they don't need these very often, which is great. You can also make their enclosure bioactive if you want to with soil and a cleanup crew, which is what I've done, and this works pretty well just because they do produce so little waste. So when it comes to their diet, unlike other rodents conventionally kept as pets, there's no commercial food that I know of for harvest mice on the market. I'm sure someone is going to try to invent that at some point and it's just going to be a disaster, but there are no store-bought commercial foods for harvest mice and there's very little information out there on what to feed them. Your best bet is to just give them a variety. They are omnivores and in the wild they'll be living amongst the crops, eating seeds and things. So what I do is I give them a bunch of different mixes, bird mixes, wild bird seed mixes, pet bird mixes like budgie mixes. I get a couple of these that have a variety of different seeds and things in them, mix this together to make my own mix, and also put in some mealworms as a protein source. I have tried them with a few other components that you would find in a fancy mouse food, things like pea flakes, and they're not that bothered, they just want seeds. You will also want to fill their enclosure with sprays as enrichment and also just something to climb on, things like millet sprays, flax sprays. You can find these down the bird section or the parrot section of the pet store, or I do sell pre-packaged packs of these on my online store and I'll link those in the description. Now, unlike other rodents like rats and fancy mice where I always advocate for scatter feeding instead of using a bowl, for harvest mice I do recommend giving them their main food in a bowl instead. Compared to rats and fancy mice, they're not really that good at digging or foraging for food. If their food is going under the bedding, they're going hungry, so just make sure you're playing it safe and just making things easier. Give them their main seed mix in a bowl. They've got sprays and things instead they can use as enrichment. One of the good things about harvest mice, because they are so small, is they don't really go through that much food, and that does make them quite inexpensive. I've barely made a dent in the food that I made for them. The most expensive part is going to be buying the sprays and the millet. That can get quite costly. Harvest mice are social animals, and it's recommended to have at least a trio minimum just to have a stable social dynamic, and just in case one suddenly passes away, because they are harder to find and come across, you're not going to be left with one by itself, so the more the merrier. This isn't always straightforward though. Both males and females can be quite territorial and randomly fall out and need separating and separate company, which can be quite difficult to deal with. Their social structures seem to be a bit more unstable than things like fancy rats and fancy mice, where suddenly they'll just wake up and decide they hate each other, and you've got to somehow deal with this. So you can either have a group of females or a group of males. Some people do commonly keep them in mixed sex groups. Obviously this is going to result in babies, and you have to be prepared for that. It's not something I necessarily advocate that everyone goes and does, especially if you've never kept them before, but it is quite commonly done, and it can be quite useful, especially to ensure you've always got constant company when they're otherwise quite difficult to find, and get new ones if you need to. As I said before, if this is something you are considering doing and having a mixed sex group, please go and do further research, and also make sure you are bringing in new mice from time to time, new genetics, because that can cause issues. Mine came from a big group of mice that had just been breeding and breeding for generations, and my mouse's brothers, one of them had very underdeveloped eyes and the other one had one ear, so please make sure you're avoiding any issues like that and know what you're doing before breeding harvest mice or any animals. With females, you tend to get one dominant breeding female, and she is going to stick out from the rest. She is going to be a much more rusty orange colour with a very white belly, compared to the others that stay much more of a natural brown colour. Unfortunately, they can just become very aggressive towards each other, seemingly out of the blue, chasing, biting off tails and limbs, and even killing each other, so I do recommend having a spare enclosure on hand to separate just in case. So when it comes to holding them, they are very quick and very delicate. There's a reason I'm not sat here demonstrating with one right now, because I can't concentrate on talking and also making sure they're not going to escape, because they can be very quick. So for that reason, I don't recommend them as a pet for small children or children in general, and also just for regular handling. They don't really seem to have as good depth perception as rats and fancy mice that won't tend to jump off if you're holding them. I've had a couple of times when mine have literally fell off my hand, so make sure you're holding them very close to you or close to the floor just in case. But if they do get out, you are going to have a very hard time catching them and getting them back, so I don't recommend holding them very often for that reason. Sometimes you can allow them to walk out onto your hand and they will sit there for a while and look around and be quite content. Other times they're going to go absolutely crazy, run up your arm, around your back, so just be very careful. For sexing purposes and also doing health checks, you can very gently lift them up by the base of their tail, keep their front feet still on a surface or on your hand just to give them a bit more support, and just have a quick look, but obviously never ever pick them up by any other part of their tail to handle them or pick them up. This can be quite painful and also obviously do a lot of damage. Another good thing about harvest mice is they rarely really bite unless you're handling them too roughly or you've got them in a compromising position. Even if they do, because they are so small, it doesn't really hurt and it doesn't break the skin. One of the best things about harvest mice is they do tend to be quite healthy, unlike other animals like rats and fancy mice that have been mass bred and mass produced and do get very common issues like respiratory infections and tumours. You're not going to see these in harvest mice very often, if at all. One of the biggest things you will come across is fur loss due to things like mites, and this can be quite tricky to deal with because you can't really use any commercial treatments, mite treatments, parasite treatments on the market for things like fancy mice because they're too small for the dosage. So instead, what tends to be recommended is this anti-parasite spray, getting a tiny droplet of this onto a Q-tip or a cotton bud and then applying this to the back of their neck when they're itching or you see them starting to lose fur. Besides that, as I mentioned before, you are going to see things like tail loss and other injuries due to fighting, but otherwise they seem pretty healthy and some can live up to around 3 years old. Unfortunately, because they are so uncommon to keep as a pet and they are so small, you are going to struggle to find a vet that's going to treat them if anything does go wrong. Even vets that do commonly treat fancy mice and fancy rats probably are going to struggle with something so small, and there is going to be less treatment options. You might have better luck with a wildlife vet and someone that does deal with very small mice on a regular basis, but the treatment options are going to be quite slim for things like operations. It's just not really possible. Now, this doesn't mean this is a pet for someone who doesn't want to go to the vets. You are still going to have to take them to the vets if they're suffering or struggling or in pain for any reason. Just be aware the treatment options are quite slim, but minimum if they are suffering, you still have to take them to the vets to at least be euthanized. Overall, harvest mice are relatively easy to care for. The biggest challenges are how disgusting these tiny animals manage to make their water every single day, and also sourcing them ethically and also treating them if anything does go wrong. But they do make a much more hands-off alternative to fancy mice and fancy rats. Once their enclosure is set up, it does look really nice and makes a really nice display tank where you can watch them moving around, looking for food, and they are so entertaining. But please, if you are considering owning them, only do so if you have a plan moving forward for when they start to pass away. If you've not got a consistent supply locally, or you don't know what to do with the last mouse, or you don't have anyone that also has harvest mice that can take them, it's best not to get them. I do also recommend joining this Harvest Mouse group on Facebook. There's really good information and care advice on there, and also sometimes people will post and advertise mice they've got that's excess from their breeding projects or just in general that haven't got on with their group. That can be a really good place to find some available compared to things like selling sites or pet stores that aren't always the most ethical place to get them. But I hope this video was helpful if you are considering getting harvest mice or you just wanted to see them. Don't forget to subscribe, and I'll see you in my next video. Bye!